This is Cornstalks and Sports Talk, your go-to Iowa-based sports show, hosted by the one and only Eliot Clough.
What's up, Cedar Valley, and hello to the Hawkeye State. This is Cornstalks and Sports Talk, your Iowa-based sports show here on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com. My name is Eliot Clough, at Eliot Clough on Twitter. I'm a UNI insider for Town Square Media. Before we get started, make sure if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, you subscribe, follow, etc., so you make sure you never miss an episode of Cornstalks and Sports Talk, whether it's these Saturday morning episodes or, of course, those midweek ones we have. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, leave that rate and review. It does help us out so much. We've had a spike in those, and therefore we've had a spike in listeners as well. Apple Podcasts make sure to promote the podcasts that do well on their platform. So it's great that we have that happen from time to time. Kennington Smith, Iowa sports beat writer for the Des Moines Register, is joining us today. He's talking a little bit about that Kadyn Proctor Oregon visit, his thoughts on that, and then Iowa basketball, their win over Seton Hall earlier this week. Chris Rosvoglou of the Straight Up Saints podcast and Boot Krewe Media hops on to tell us about New Orleans signing legendary UNI running back David Johnson. He's back on an NFL roster, kind of. And then, of course, we've got Trevor Penning, an update on his health from Chris. So stick around for that. First, we have this ever-important UNI matchup with South Dakota this weekend in the Dakota Dome. And it's maybe kind of could have an effect on the Panthers' playoff hopes. And I'll elaborate on that in a little bit later towards the end of this segment. But before we get to that, I do want to preview the game. And this one is pretty weird. Of course, UNI coming off a bye week pretty late in the season. You know, UNI doesn't typically have a bye week this late, nor do most teams. Of course, South Dakota State has a bye week this week after finishing 10-0 against the FCS. So crazy situation for them, too. And on top of that, UNI finishes typically their season at home, but now, of course, they're going to be away at South Dakota in the Dakota Dome in Vermilion. But, and you know, the weirdness just continues to add up for this game, especially when you look at who South Dakota is, too. And again, we have three things to watch regarding this game on the KOEL website, the KOEL app, so you can go check that out. It's from me, Eliot Clough, but it's weird for a lot of reasons. And the first thing that comes to mind is that USD is 3-7 overall going into this game, and they're 3-1 at home. So how much do you take into consideration how good they are at home versus how tough their schedule was away, and their one loss at home was to North Dakota State. So what do you do with that information? They beat Southern Illinois at home in the Dakota Dome, as well as UNI beating SIU on the road. So how do you factor that in? How good is South Dakota? Because with this gauntlet of an non-conference schedule, they played Montana when Montana was the number 2 team in the country at that point in time in the FCS, and that has a factor, right? That has an intimidation factor. They were in Missoula, so I still consider that a really tough game. They lost 24-7, and they also got throttled by Kansas State 34-0. And then after they had their first win of the season against Cal Poly, they went on to lose to number 1 and number 2 South Dakota State and North Dakota State. And then again, they followed that up with wins over then number 14 SIU and Missouri State at home. And on top of that, you throw in a quarterback's change, which I thought South Dakota was still going to be relevant this season despite their schedule. I thought they'd win some of these games they've lost, including like that game against who was it? Youngstown State, at Youngstown State, like games like that. I thought they were for sure going to win those, especially having been good like they were last year. They had Tice. I think it was Tice who got hurt in that first game. Maybe I'm wrong. They had somebody get hurt and a few guys transfer, if I remember correctly. Carson Camp was great as a freshman, a true freshman for South Dakota. They went into the Unidome and beat the Panthers last year, 34-21. And then Carson Camp gets benched for Aiden Bowman, who's a 3-star transfer from Iowa State. So how much do you take that into consideration? I mean, Will McIlvain was pretty solid, and then he got benched for Theo Day. So he's a Michigan State transfer. Like, how do you gauge that? Is it just based on the fact that they were good and came from an FBS school, or is it truly because of how poorly the starting quarterback has been playing? So take that into consideration. And then the fact that USD's offensive coordinator, they said they mutually parted ways. He got fired in mid-October, and it's really difficult to gauge how good they are. I mean, Bowman's a solid football player too. He won MVFC Newcomer of the Week. Let's see here. I have it tagged in the article, that preview article that I wrote. I believe I do anyway. Yeah, he won the Newcomer of the Week after leading the Coyotes to their win against Missouri State in just his second career start. He threw for 235 yards and 2 touchdowns in that game. He's a lefty, which makes things a little bit more difficult, but it's just odd. And to know that they're 3-1 at home, UNI is going to the Dome. It's a weird situation. It's tough to determine who the Coyotes are, what they're going to bring to the table on Saturday. Granted, UNI's coming off a bye week. They might think their playoff hopes are gone, dashed. Who knows? Who really knows? I'm looking forward to this game for a variety of reasons. Obviously, UNI football still happening. It kind of felt like it was over this last week, and so it's good to see them back. But I'll throw the mixed bag of goods to the side for a second on who South Dakota State is. And I want to talk about some of their rankings that kind of prove indeed who they are. Again, we didn't get into this in that preview article on the KOEL website. So yeah, stick around for this here on Corn Stalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com. I'm Eliot Clough, UNI insider for Town Square Media. We're previewing that UNI versus South Dakota game this weekend in Vermilion. All right, I'm just going to go down the list. Offense, 3rd down conversion, South Dakota, 95th in the country. 4th down conversion, 123rd, literally dead last in the country. This is their offense. They've allowed 4 block kicks, which is 103rd in the country. Their offense is only 115th in total first downs rather. They're the 102nd ranked team in passing, 166.4 yards per game. They've allowed they're 117th in sacks allowed, which is 34th, and somehow not last in the MVFC because Missouri State is that just atrocious at allowing sacks. They're 110th in scoring at 16.5 points per game, and they're 108th in total offense at 291 yards per game. So those things are pretty telling of who the Coyotes are and what their offense is capable of, even with the change at quarterback and even with the gauntlet of a schedule. Like, ball don't lie, numbers don't lie. And then, of course, their defense ranks 107th in tackles for loss, and they rank 113th in time of possession, which is 26 minutes and 41 seconds per game. So the numbers tell the story to a degree. Obviously, like I mentioned, that flipping quarterback changes things a little bit, and the fact that they're playing at home. Granted, the Dakota Dome, I watched the film of their game against Southern Illinois going into UNI's matchup with the Salukis, I don't know, like a month ago, 3 weeks ago. And that place, they were strategic with where they placed cameras. I'll tell you that. It was homecoming, and there were very few people there. I don't know if it's the travel. I don't know if it's the circumstances of who they played at the Dakota Dome, but that is not a home field advantage like it once was. Sure, it'll get loud in there because it is a dome, but I would put it. I would say that SIU game is an outlier. Beating Missouri State isn't the accomplishment that it once was, and Cal Poly's not a good football team. So factor that in, and it kind of makes sense as to why that team is 3-1 and their home loss being to North Dakota State. So assuming UNI comes into this game ready, assuming they do believe that they have a chance to get into the playoffs, then I would say that UNI wins this game handily. And we'll talk about the chance of the playoffs here in just a second. But a couple other things to watch in this game that I did include in that article, that preview article, is, well, number one, it's Matthew Cook. If he makes another field goal, he'll have sole possession of the career field goals record in the Missouri Valley Football Conference and at UNI, which is huge. Billy Holmgren, I want to say, is who it was that set that record before. I got to look here. He's the kicker between 2006 and 2010. Yes, Billy Hallgren, no M in there. Billy Hallgren, he had 64 in that time period, so it'd be a huge accomplishment for Matthew Cook. The only other kicker in FCS that has more career field goals right now is, let's see here, it is Skylar Davis from Elon, who has 67. So Matthew Cook, clearly, if not the best kicker in the FCS, one of the best, and he has deserved everything he's got. Works incredibly hard, and this season he's had that turnover with the holder and the snapper, and things just have really... He would have it already. I think he would have it already if it wasn't for that change, because he is such a good kicker and he's so talented and he's worked so hard. So watch for that. If he makes that field goal, that'll be the case this weekend. And then can UNI get to the quarterback, man? Like last season, this team had, I want to say, 36 sacks over their, I think it was 12 games. This season they have 17 through 10. And granted, they had 12 sacks, which was a school record against Western Illinois last year in that final game of the season. But still, that's a significant difference in sacks for a team that has pass rushers like Devin Rice and Cannon Butler, and of course Kadyn Hotelling and Christian Boyd now being out. I'm not sure if Christian Boyd's going to play this weekend, but I know Kadyn Hotelling is not. That really impacts their ability to get to the quarterback. Kadyn Hotelling, I think he had 7.5 sacks last season. This season, just a half a sack, which is telling of how available he's been. And of course, that's got to be frustrating for him. Super talented kid. I've enjoyed every conversation I've had with him too. So just sad to see. You have to assume he'll get a medical red shirt and he'll be back for an extra season. But in total, over the last 5 games, UNI just has 7 sacks. Didn't get to Nick Baker against SIU. Didn't get to Mark Gronowski against SDSU 2 weeks ago. And they had 5 sacks against Missouri State, 2 sacks against Utah Tech. So they need to get to the quarterback. They need to get to Todd Bowman this week and add up to that. You got to get over 20 sacks in one season. If you got the talent that UNI does, it'll be, obviously it's going to be up to some guys that UNI hasn't seen a ton of in terms of getting to the quarterback, like Jack Krebs and Cannon Butler has been there. He's in the backfield, but hasn't resulted in sacks, and the leader in sacks for UNI this year is Spencer Cuvalier with 3. And I think Devin Rice has 3 as well. So it's just telling. If I remember correctly, I think Jared Brinkman had 10 last season, maybe the season before that. So this team really needs to get to the quarterback, and they should. Again, I mean, you look at the stats, USD ranks, let's see here, 117th in sacks allowed with 34. So you got to get to the quarterback against this team, especially against a 3-star lefty from Iowa State and Bowman, who has shown some pretty, he's shown talent. We'll say that. And I think if he earns that job, Carson Camp will probably transfer to another FCS school, and he's deserving of it. And I think he's just had trouble with the pressure and the change in the offensive coordinator and so many different things this season. He is a talented kid, but UNI is going to have to rely on Cannon Butler, Devin Rice, Jack Krebs, Cordarius Bailey, and Carter Hewitt to get to the quarterback this weekend. I'm going to assume they're probably going to go that 4-down lineman because they're not too worried about the passing offense, even with Bowman. And the running game is sort of USD's go-to. So I'm assuming it's going to be 4-down linemen, and then you'll have Corby Sander in that sort of quasi linebacker role along with Edwin Dearman. So we'll see what happens this weekend. We'll see if UNI can pull out the victory to end the season. And I'll tell you what, the thing that will determine UNI's playoff chances, it doesn't have anything to do with USD. I'll say that right now. It doesn't have anything to do with USD. UNI could win 63-0, and I don't think that would affect how the committee looks at them and considers their playoff chances. They have to win, and preferably it won't be close. 14 to 21 points or more. But what really matters is how the committee looks at those games against Sacramento State. The fact that UNI got back in that game late. The game against like North Dakota, the 2-point loss. The game against South Dakota State is the really big one, in my opinion, this recent stretch of games, rather. Because if they look at that and say, man, they almost beat the number one team in the country and had that leaping call not happened, maybe they go to overtime, maybe they win. Because if UNI won that football game, then they'd be in the playoffs. Like, no doubt about it in my mind. Not even a little bit. That is a playoff team. And if it's by that close of a margin that they're not, and they were receiving votes not last week or the week before that, but the 2 weeks, I think, prior to that game, they'd be in the top 25. Granted, they'd be 6-4 right now, probably 7-4 at the end of the season, and that's a much better playoff record than 6-5, just by the look of it. So, to me, it's what does the committee say in regards to that loss? What do they say when they look at that close game against the number one team in the country and how close UNI played them? And do they deserve a playoff spot? So once again, folks, my name is Eliot Clough, at Eliot Clough on Twitter. We're going to head to break here, but don't go anywhere. We have Kennington Smith from the Des Moines Register. He's talking with us a little bit about Iowa basketball and Kadyn Proctor going on that Oregon visit. We're going to be right here for more Corn Stalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com. Iowa men's basketball coming off a nice win last night over another team receiving votes in the AP poll, Seton Hall. That win comes at 83-67. On to talk with us now on Corn Stalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com is Kennington Smith, Iowa beat writer for the Des Moines Register. Kennington, big takeaways from last night's win, how the Hawkeyes pulled off that W against the talented Pirates team.
Yeah, I think that my biggest takeaway was there is no shortage of veteran leadership on the team. Last night was a contest in which Seton Hall pressed Iowa early, and they put a lot of pressure on them, and Iowa got down. They had to call an early timeout to kind of recalibrate. And the question that you're asking if you're watching from home is who is going to be the player that steps up and stabilizes this group? Jordan Bohannon has done that in the past as a veteran. Obviously, Keegan Murray was that guy last year. Who was going to be that guy this year? And Chris Murray answered the bell early on and really kind of put the offense on his back. And I think as the game went on, you saw Patrick McCaffrey making big plays. You saw Tony Perkins making big plays. You saw Philip Obrachin, Aaron Eulis, and Connor McCaffrey. Several players had moments, and it just seems like this team is very balanced. Seems like they're, very veteran, a lot of leadership, like I said. So that's exactly what you want to see from a team on the road for the first time and battling a little bit of adversity. So I thought it was the first big test for Iowa, but I believe they passed it with flying colors. And I think that you have to look at this team as one that, is built to kind of contend throughout the season just because they have so many older players in the top part of their rotation.
So I definitely want to talk about Chris Murray, Tony Perkins, some of these other guys who stepped up last night. The number one thing that I've seen in the time that I've been able to watch Iowa basketball this season is the fact that they're really lacking in the paint. You mentioned Philip Obrachin, but he's 6'8", 6'9". They don't really have a big guy to compete with some of these other big guys in the country. Did Seton Hall try to expose that last night, or were they able to?
Not really. I mean, Philip, the physicality that he played with was noticeable. And comparatively to last year, this year, he just looks so much stronger and so much more confident. I think that's probably a reason why he was able to kind of neutralize that size disadvantage. I mean, you look at his stat line last night, 10 points, 11 boards, 4 blocks. The picks that he was setting, and I know there's not a statistic for how hard you set a pick, but the picks he set on offense really sprung a lot of players open. I'm thinking of the Patrick McCaffrey and one dunk. Phillips set that screen at the top, really hard screen, allowed Patrick free run at the rim. So the physicality that he's playing with this year, I think mitigates that, because last year, I don't think he played with that same aggression, but I do think it is still a concern. I mean, last night, Iowa did a very good job of not getting into foul trouble. And when you're not in foul trouble, that type of a play can work with Philip at the 5 and Chris Murray at the 4. But if one of them gets into foul trouble and you have to go into that front court depth behind them, there are still going to be some question marks there with Josh Gundelin and Riley Mulvey as kind of the backup centers. So something to monitor throughout the year. I think that Fran is still looking for those guys that he can trust off of the bench past Aaron Eulis and Connor McCaffrey. And that's going to be something that I'm going to be paying attention to a lot more as the non-conference schedule plays out.
I was actually planning on asking you about that. Only going 7 deep last night in total, 2 guys off the bench. Of course, Josh Dix and Desante Bowen getting a few minutes. I think Josh Dix got 1 minute and Desante Bowen got 3. So you can't really count that as going deep into your bench. Are you expecting that to be sort of a regular thing until maybe somebody proves their worth off the bench this season? Is it going to be a short bench for the Hawkeyes in 2022, 2023?
I think it definitely has the potential to. You look at last night with that game at Seton Hall, that was not a game for young players to be out there because Seton Hall puts a lot of ball pressure on, and you saw Iowa's veteran players turning it over, and it was turning into Seton Hall runs. There was not, I don't think, a place for kind of like a true freshman who hasn't built up that level of trust yet with Fran to kind of perform in those moments. And you look at the bench that Iowa had last year, Connor McCaffrey, veteran, Aaron Eulis, Tony Perkins, Chris Murray have all played. And then Peyton Sanford was the only freshman amongst a lot of guys who had already played. And then you look at this year's bench and you have Connor and Aaron, who obviously are vets. And then past them, you have a lot of uncertainty. You just don't have that same amount of experience. So I think that's probably the big reason why he's only going 7 right now. I think it's just a matter of how quickly can Desante and Josh Dix develop. And I think you got to throw Josh Ogunleye in that conversation as well. Like how quickly can he earn the trust of the coaching staff to make this a 9 deep, 10 deep team? So until that happens, I see them going 7. But like I said in my last point, that works well when you're not in foul trouble. So if Iowa can continue to do that, then they should be fine. But I would expect, obviously those guys are going to get opportunities as the season goes on. But I think, the tournament in Florida, that's next weekend, that'll probably be the next opportunity. We'll see maybe some guys, off the bench, get a little bit more run. They have Nebraska, Omaha on Monday, so that'll be a game where everybody will get to play, and then we'll see what happens in practice the following days after to see who can kind of continue gaining their trust.
Again, Kennington Smith from the Des Moines Register on with us this morning on Corn Stalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com. He's an Iowa beat writer, so talking a little bit about the Hawkeyes on the court so far this season. Chris Murray last night, 29 points. From what I've been able to see, you can kind of tell by watching the way he's playing, the way he's carrying himself. He knows that he's the guy and that this is the season where he bumps up his draft stock. Did that show to you last night with those 29 points and the way he stepped up, finishing with a double-double?
Yeah, I think that last night it made it definitively clear that he is the number one. And I feel like it's always been that case, but when you look at the quality of opponents in their first 2 games, he didn't need to just take the game over and score 30. And I think in those first 2 games, he was a little bit passive to start, and then the game just naturally came to him, and he still finished with great numbers. But I think last night was him being that assertive, give me the ball, let me kind of go to work, and everybody's going to kind of feed off of me. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, he had at one point, Iowa went down 10-3, then he goes on his run, and Seton Hall calls a timeout, and it's 16-13, and Chris has 12 points, almost as many as Seton Hall does. So you saw that, and then, again, you just saw everybody kind of feed off of that, and they just played together. So, obviously it's not going to be the same as last year with Keegan. I don't think Chris is going to lead the nation in points or anything like that, but I don't think he has to because, again, the team is just so much more balanced than it was last year in terms of scoring and guys who can contribute. So Chris is going to continue to dominate. I feel like my biggest takeaway last night is we saw him scoring at all 3 levels, a little bit more than we saw in the first 2 games. You could tell he's really worked on his game a lot, and then strong as well with the 11 rebounds. So I know that there were some scouts in attendance last night, and he definitely impressed them. And I just expect him to continue to flourish in this role the rest of the year.
Now, I know you're not necessarily an NBA guy. You cover the Hawkeyes, right? But how much do you think that Chris can improve his draft stock, and how much Keegan's play this season can improve his draft stock?
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at what Keegan is doing, and naturally you think, okay, like if he took that leap, Chris can take that same leap, and he can start to do those same things. When it comes to Chris's draft stock, is really interesting because he's coming out in a year where in NBA circles, this class is regarded as kind of like one of those potentially historic classes. Obviously at the top, you have Victor Wembanyama, Scoot Henderson. There's a lot of depth down through the lottery. So in order for Chris to be in that conversation, he really is going to have to play at a really high level this year. I think right now I'll probably look at him as like a mid first round pick. I think if he can be, I don't know if he'll be a 20-point per game scorer, but if he can be, 18, 9 rebounds, a few assists, a few blocks, just play well on defense and, lead Iowa back to, potentially another Big Ten championship. Those are the type of things that I think are going to solidify his stock. So he's a first round talent. I just think that teams need to see him do it for an entire season to just kind of validate those things. And I would expect him to be, a first round pick, which again would really say a lot considering how deep and how talented this 23 class is.
Now, recently we talked to Sean Bach from 24/7 Sports about this 2023 basketball recruiting class. That was before, I'm going to mess up how to pronounce this guy's name. Is it Ladji Dembele?
Yes.
Okay. Ladji Dembele decided to commit to play for the Hawks. These other 3 players were top 150 guys. How big of a win was it getting a commit from Dembele, and what is he going to bring to Iowa City?
Yeah, I think it was a big one, just for the reason that we've kind of talked about it already through the course of this conversation. Iowa's front court depth is in question. And, Chris Murray is going to leave at the end of this year. Connor McCaffrey is going to leave. Philip Obrach is going to leave. You need to replenish that front court. And I'm looking at Dembele as a physically impressive guy. I mean, 6'8", 6'9", already 230 pounds. So he has that weight on him. He is a little bit more of like a raw prospect, somebody who probably is not going to command a lot of minutes early, but somebody who can be developed and eventually turn into, a frontline starter. And if you look at Iowa and their track record with development, Luka Garza, Joe Wieskamp, and then with the Murrays now, and you look at what, some of the younger players on the roster, the Peyton Sanford, you bring in a guy who you might consider as a project or somebody who wasn't as highly recruited as others, you have confidence that Fran and his staff will be able to develop him and bring him along. So, and you're looking at the class, it fills out nicely. I think, Brock Harding at point guard is going to provide some depth. Price Sanford, if he's anything, like Peyton, and from what Peyton and Fran said, that Price is a little bit more advanced, than Peyton was at this stage. So you feel great about what he can bring. And then Owen Freeman, obviously another top-rated guy who's going to be able to come in and compete at that front court. So you got 3 top 150 guys, and you bring in Dembele as a little bit of a project, and you got to feel really good about what that class can bring to the table, once they all get on campus.
Again, Kennington Smith from the Des Moines Register joining us this morning on Corn Stalks and Sports Talk on AM 950, KOEL, and KOEL.com. He's an Iowa Hawkeye sports beat writer for the Des Moines Register. Now, let's flip sports here. It is also football season, which makes things crazy for guys like you and me, this crossover here. Right. But sticking with recruiting, the sort of topic of conversation at hand right now for everyone that either covers the Hawkeyes, watches the Hawkeyes, or is an Iowa fan is Kadyn Proctor having visited Oregon. Now, we talked about it on this midweek episode that we had earlier this week on Corn Stalks and Sports Talk, but what are your thoughts, man? I mean, you cover the team, you cover recruiting. Kadyn Proctor, obviously one of the biggest recruits in Iowa history, taking this official visit. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I have a little bit of an interesting perspective because I've grown up in the South and I went to the University of Georgia. Obviously, when I'm not being an objective reporter, I'm a Georgia fan and I follow their recruiting and everything that happens as well. And to me, I interpreted this as something that is very normal and commonplace when you're recruiting at the highest level. When you're somebody of Kadyn Proctor's acumen, just because he commits does not mean that other schools are not going to stop recruiting him, because as Iowa fans know, when they poach recruits from the MAC or the SES or wherever else, nothing is official until it's signed on signing day. So teams are going to relentlessly recruit him and try to flip him away from Iowa. So that's my first reaction is like, I'm not surprised that teams kept recruiting him. I'm a little surprised about the visit and the timing of the visit because he did seem very locked in with Iowa. If you remember his recruitment in the summertime, he had an opportunity to take all of his officials and he decided not to and narrowed it down. And then he just ended up committing to Iowa. And he's been a very frequent visitor at Iowa games throughout this season. So on the surface, he did look very locked in. So I'm a little surprised from that aspect, but this is recruiting. So, things are subject to change. And if I'm a fan, I would probably be a little concerned just because signing day is a month away and he just pops up for this official, and Oregon is rolling right now. I mean, let's just be honest. Up until last week, they were in the playoff discussion. They're still in the Rose Bowl discussion. They're a top 10 team. They have a lot of momentum on the field and on the trail as well. So a little bit of a threat, but I feel like Iowa should still feel good about where they are, just considering everything leading into his recruitment and him committing to them over Alabama in the first place. So it's just something that we're going to have to, I think, wait a little while longer to see how everything plays out and just kind of go from there. So I wouldn't advise anybody to hit the panic button until there's actually a decommitment.
Last thing for you, Kennington, before we let you go, Iowa taking on Minnesota today. It's going to be real cold in the Twin Cities. Any predictions for this game? You think Iowa pulls it out? And how's that temperature going to affect the game?
Yeah, I mean, Iowa just has so much momentum right now, and I do think they're going to win the game. I think that there is going to be such an emphasis on stopping Mo Ibrahim from Minnesota, and if it is Kaliak Manis, the backup for Minnesota, he's going to be put into a pretty disadvantageous situation against Iowa's defense and Phil Parker if it's in a must-passing situation. I mean, I just look at it as them being able to confuse him and potentially cause a lot of mistakes. The weather's going to have a huge impact. Both teams are going to want to keep it on the ground, but I have more faith in Iowa's rush defense to keep Minnesota at bay and maybe even create some opportunities for the offense. So I believe I have it around like 16-10 Iowa. I mean, it's going to be low scoring and it's going to be a physical one, but Iowa's going to be playing for a lot. I do believe Michigan will beat Illinois and kind of pave the way for Iowa to win the West. So I think they're going to kind of take advantage of the opportunity and beat Minnesota and set up a kind of a winner-take-all against Nebraska.
Man, who would have thought you'd be saying that a month ago? Not me, that's for sure.
It sounds crazy as we're talking about it right now.
Right. He is Kennington Lloyd Smith from the Des Moines Register, Iowa beat writer there, joining us this morning on Corn Stalks and Sports Talk. Go give him a follow for all the Iowa recruiting, sports news, all that. It's at @SkinnyKenny_ on Twitter. Kennington, we appreciate you, man.
For sure. Thank you.
Alrighty, don't go anywhere. We got Chris Rosvoglou of the Straight Up Saints podcast and Boot Krewe Media joining us up next to talk about former UNI legend and running back David Johnson signing to the practice squad for New Orleans. And of course, we get an update on Trevor Penning and his health as well. Stay right here on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com for more Corn Stalks and Sports Talk.
Former UNI running back and one of the best to ever do it in a Panther uniform, David Johnson is officially back on an NFL team after signing a practice squad deal with the New Orleans Saints. Yes, he's officially a teammate of Trevor Penning now, UNI's first ever first-round NFL draft pick. On Corn Stalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com. To talk the signing and more is Chris Rosvoglou of the Straight Up Saints podcast and Boot Krewe Media. Chris, from what I gather on Twitter, it appears the Saints have been looking for running back depth all season. Obviously, David was there in camp, but no deal got done. Do you know what hampered getting that deal done this summer?
It was interesting. No one really came out with the full disclosure of it, but with the way it kind of went down, it felt like some type of contract language just didn't work out for them. As for what the language was, no one really knows, but it's interesting because David Johnson was in the building. Is he the David Johnson of old? No, but the Saints had him in training camp. They like what they saw for the most part. Everyone loves his leadership. Everyone talks about David Johnson, the person in a very high regard. And the Saints never figured out that whole running back situation. Obviously, Alvin Kamara has been Alvin Kamara, and Mark Ingram is another good leader, but they're waiting for that third back or kind of that second option if Ingram wasn't going to pan out. And unfortunately, he's been banged up. And even since not getting done deal with Johnson, they were looking for guys. They put in a claim for Benjamin. That didn't work out. So the Saints have been in the market for it. It kind of makes sense that they go back to a guy who is a really quick learner, and he's not going to have to learn about it at all. He already knows the system down in New Orleans. So now it makes a lot of sense. And with Dwayne Washington not really being that running back in a serviceable manner on the offense, he's more of a special teams guy. We'll see what happens. Maybe they kick the tires on David here, activate him, and he could do something for them on game days.
So the practice squad signing was interesting, especially, week 11, former Pro Bowler. But like you said, he's not the David Johnson of old, of course. What's with the move and why now?
Yeah, I think for starters, in terms of why now, the Saints have been big on when they're winning, and it hasn't been a lot this year. It's been through the run game, right? You think of Taysom Hill having over 100 yards rushing against the Seahawks. You think of Alvin Kamara having 150 plus scrimmage yards against the Raiders and 3 touchdowns there. You think of even week 1, the Saints, they threw it through most of their yards was through the air, but even at some points, Taysom Hill had some big runs there. And you think of it and you look at it, it's like, okay, great. There are moments where Taysom Hill kind of leads the charge offensively. There's moments where Alvin Kamara obviously does what he's been doing for the last 5 years. But the Saints need more depth there. You can't just rely on your playmakers week in, week out to give you 150 plus scrimmage yards, especially if defenses like last week with the Steelers come in 8 men in the box and basically say, Alvin Kamara is not going to beat us today. You need that complementary piece. And ever since Mark Ingram's gone, down with an injury, the Saints have been looking around. They really haven't found that. They haven't really gotten that with Dwayne Washington. Jordan Howard, they brought him in to see what he's got left in the tank at this point. And honestly, it doesn't seem like it's much at the moment. So the Saints end up moving on there. And I think it makes sense, whatever worked out with David Johnson's perspective, obviously didn't work out the first time with them making a deal. But like you said, you're entering week 11. If you're David Johnson, you want to show the league you can still play. This is going to be a nice little showcase if he gets out on the field for about 6-7 weeks to show teams even for next year what he can bring to the table if he gets that opportunity. So I think for New Orleans, it's all about trying to find a complementary back to Alvin Kamara, because right now Mark Ingram still isn't practicing because of his knee injury, but also just getting more guys out there who are playmakers. The Saints really, injuries have hurt them this year a lot, especially on offense, and they're just lacking being able to make those kind of changes. You think when the Saints are at their best, they've had depth in the backfield. They just don't have that this year.
And it's added playmaking and a veteran, a guy who's done it before, who is going to be a great addition to your locker room too.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, in terms of what David Johnson brings to the table, even though you're not expecting all-pro David Johnson, the one thing that made David Johnson such an exciting player for so many years was he literally checked off every single box. You want him to be a hard-nosed runner, he can do that. You want him to be a great receiver out of the backfield, he did that in Bruce Arians' offense all the time. You needed him on special teams, he can make plays on special teams, and obviously the leadership is just kind of an added bonus to all the gifts he had on the football field. So I think for the Saints, he gives them all that, and they really haven't had that with the other options. Like I said, Dwayne Washington, great special teams guy, but he really isn't a playmaker at running back on the offensive side of things. And you look around like Jordan Howard, yeah, he's a bruiser back, but is he going to make plays out of the backfield? Even at this stage in his career, I think David Johnson can be a boost and an upgrade in certain capacities in guys like Jordan Howard, guys like Dwayne Washington. And for that move, I think it's a no-brainer. At the very least, if something works, you get a little bit of upgrade and some production there. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You kick the tires on a veteran with 6 to 7 weeks left in the season.
And on top of that, too, something I just thought about is, obviously he's not going to be your main back either. You got Alvin Kamara on the roster. So he can do really well in maybe limited snaps where you can get, full bore David Johnson as opposed to expecting, 20 carries a game.
Yeah, no, for sure. Because when you looked at, Mark Ingram in the RB2 role, the Saints are really giving him 8 carries, some on good days, 10 carries. And look, if you're sitting there and you're David Johnson, if you give the Saints 8 carries for, 30 rushing yards, Saints will take that. Absolutely. They would definitely take that for sure, because they're not getting that at the moment. And even if you think of Mark Ingram, his best game, he had about 50 rushing yards on 10 carries against the Buccaneers in week 2. And that, before he fumbled the football, was considered an awesome performance from that spot. So to your point, yeah, you're not really asked to just carry the load like you did in Arizona. You're just saying be good in the moments that they bring you out there, kind of those spot minutes. And who knows? I look, in terms of physique wise, David Johnson is still in terrific shape. We saw that in training camp. The guy was out there and he just built different compared to other running backs. So now it's just all about if he's still got that burst. And we'll see. And I do agree. I think the limited snaps makes it a little bit easier on him. There's not a lot of pressure here to carry the backfield.
Again, we have Chris Rosvoglou from the Straight Up Saints podcast and Boot Krewe Media on with us this morning on Corn Stalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com. Talking a little bit about that David Johnson signing, of course, former UNI great running back. Now, do you expect him to make that 53-man roster at any point in the coming weeks? I know we've kind of been talking about it as if it's a formality, but considering he just signed to the practice squad, do you see him getting on that 53-man roster?
At this rate, I would kind of be surprised if he doesn't at least get one crack at it, just because we've seen the Saints over the last couple of weeks. Jordan Howard got a crack at it. The Monday night game against the Ravens, Dwayne Washington got a chance to get a couple of carries, had 3 carries there. And obviously that's not a huge workload, but he still got that opportunity. Jordan Howard and Dwayne Washington didn't provide anything. So if you're the Saints, why not? Call him up maybe this Sunday against the Rams, who have been banged up, and 5 touches, 6 touches, whatever it might be. It might not even be a big number. but if he looks at least more explosive than the alternatives, the past 2 games, that would be upside for the Saints there. So I think we'll see what happens. Mark Ingram does not look like he's on track to play this weekend, so there goes the RB2 option. And for the Saints, it comes down to, do you want to activate Dwayne Washington for special teams? Do you maybe want to activate Dwayne Washington and call up David Johnson just to have that extra option there in the backfield? Either way, I would kind of be stunned if they don't play him for at least 1 game, especially because what we talked about before, this is a guy who you brought in training camp. You couldn't work out a deal before. I find it hard to believe they'd work out a deal this time around and he doesn't get at least 1 chance on a Sunday to show what he can do.
Now, given that the news has come out, obviously UNI Panther fans are hyped, having an FCS program. You have guys here and there that make the league, and obviously some guys get opportunities every year pretty much out of UNI at this point. But what's the reaction been from the Saints fan base in this signing? I know I looked at your Twitter feed and I didn't see anything, which I was like, Chris is always on top of things. What's going on here? But it just not something that's been super overwhelming for the Saints fan base, or is it just kind of like, oh, cool? Tell me about that.
I think, back in the summer when he was there in training camp, there was definitely more reaction to it because, there was pictures of David Johnson with Kamara and Ingram, and you just think in just terms of their resumes, putting them all together, what they've accomplished in the NFL. It's very hard to find a backfield in terms of put all their total yards together, all their touchdowns, find a better group in the NFL currently. And Saints fans were really pumped about that. I could tell you, any pictures that Boot Krewe Media was getting on the ground there, I was putting on Twitter and I was excited to see. I think now more than ever, it's not a knock on David Johnson, more so Saints fans are just fatigued by the way this season has gone. And they're at the point where, like kind of you said, David Johnson gets signed and it's not like, oh, great, an extra option for a playoff push. Saints fans just kind of like, all right, one Sunday here and when's it over with? I think that more than anything, because the reaction to David Johnson's first time around with the Saints was way different than this time around. So, but we'll see if David Johnson plays on a Sunday and he has a decent performance. I can tell you from now, knowing Saints fans, they'll get excited. We saw it back in the London game on October 2nd. Latavius Murray gets called back to the team, has a really good game. Saints fans get excited. And then of course he ends up getting poached by the Broncos later that week, but Saints fans really got, pumped up for that. So we'll see, man. David Johnson, if he comes in and has a decent showing against the Rams or maybe 2 weeks from now against the 49ers, I can guarantee you the enthusiasm around him will definitely ramp up.
And so I mentioned it at the top of the segment. Still no Trevor Penning at this point in the season with the Saints first round draft pick this spring. How bad are the Saints in need of a really talented first round lineman right now? I saw, I think, again, I looked at your timeline that there was a meme on there about facing the Rams D line this coming week. So how bad are they in need of a guy like Trevor Penning right now?
I think for 2 reasons. For one, you mentioned the health part. Saints right now, in terms of injuries, they're starting left tackles banged up. Andres Peet, their starting left guard's banged up. Their starting center's on IR. And, Ryan Ramczyk, their star right tackle, he gets a lot of rest days here and there. So it's very rare to see him at practice on Wednesday. So he's dealing with stuff all the time. He just ends up playing through it. But to your point, you got 3 starting linemen that are injured. And I think the thing that people want to see about Penning, there's 2 reasons for why everyone's excited for him. One is, you draft him in the first round, a lot of potential there. Can he be your left tackle of the future? And if he can, that changes a lot because, it really is hard to shore up that position. And Trevor definitely has the potential to do that. And then B, it's something that, we've talked about before. Trevor Penning's nastiness and that kind of edge that he has, the Saints can really use that right now, because if you go back and look at the way the Saints played on Sunday against the Steelers, it's one thing to make sloppy mistakes. It's another thing to have turnovers and just end up losing a game. When you do it and the body language is off and your team looks disinterested, and you kind of start to wonder, as the losses start to pile up, are they still buying in? Are they still committed to the rest of the season? I think Trevor can kind of give them that kind of jolt of energy they need. We saw it earlier this year. The Saints bring in Alontae Taylor off IR, rookie cornerback. All of a sudden, the defense, the second game with him, ends up pitching a shutout. Now, I'm not saying the rookie directly pitched that shutout for them, but he did add that energy, and people fed off that. And I think for Trevor Penning, if he comes out here in a couple of weeks from now, and I do think we will see him sooner than later, I think that he could give this offensive line a jolt, and I think he could give this ground game a little bit of a shot in the arm that they can use, because he does have that edge, and he does want to maul guys in the run game. And I think the Saints can absolutely use him out there. And if you're a fan and you're already punting on the season and saying no playoffs, well, this is one thing you're looking for. Does your rookie offensive tackle look like the real deal? And we'll get to see at some point this year, and hopefully it's for more games than not. that Trevor Penning is legit.
So you mentioned probably here in a couple weeks that he'll at least hopefully be back. I take it the injury and the rehab process is at least going somewhat well, considering he might be able to make it back before the end of the season.
Yeah, so I mean, people, it's crazy. You never think about it when you go through injuries. What are like the worst ones in terms of timeline and stuff? You think a toe injury, like it's just a toe. But I mean, for 4 weeks he had to ride a scooter. Then 4 weeks he had to go in a walking boot. Walking boot's done. He was at practice on Wednesday. Now, people didn't see him for too long. He probably ended up doing some rehab by himself individually, which is normal. That's kind of been the case. But the fact that he's already out there at the facility again, and then Dennis Allen, when asked about it, said that he's doubtful for this Sunday, but said things are progressing well. I would not be surprised if either next week or the following week we see him back out there. The Saints have a 21-day window that opened last week, so they're going to have to be very smart about this. If they end up missing that window and he doesn't get to play, Saints fans would be fuming about that. So I do think that maybe next week against the 49ers is a possibility for Trevor Penning. What is the role? Do you thrust him into the starting lineup immediately? Do you let him, develop as that sixth extra offensive lineman in those jumbo packages? I think that might be where he starts and then kind of work his way up. But look, James Hurst is injured at left tackle. If the Saints want to kind of give him a shot and kind of throw him in the fire, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. I said throughout the preseason, Trevor Penning had a rough first game, looked really good the second game, then started off the third game outstanding before he ends up getting hurt, unfortunately. So I think we will see him at some point. He's saying all the right things. Pete Carmichael, the offensive coordinator, has said that everything's going well in his recovery process. And the fact that we're even talking about he's probably doubtful for this weekend, I feel like that's a good sign that whether it's a week from now or 2 weeks from now, he'll be back on the field.
And I tell you what, at this point in the season, a guy coming from the FCS to the NFL, reps are just important right now.
Yeah, 1,000%. And for him, look, the Saints didn't take him for the 2022 season. Of course, they would love for him to be a big factor this year, but they took him because you see Trevor Penning's potential and you see like the fact that this guy at that level, and you throw him in the Senior Bowl, make some splash plays, and you see the raw talent with the speed and the power, and you say, all right, this is someone that, yeah, right away, he's not going to be our franchise left tackle, but in 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, he's going to be someone who could be dynamic. And it's just fitting because he's replacing a guy in Teron Armstead who came from a small school. So I think it fits the mold. And to your point, Trevor Penning would benefit a ton from, let's say he gets 4 starts at the end of the season. That would help his growth next year. He probably won't have as many rookie hurdles to go over in his second year. It doesn't really feel so much as a redshirt year next season. So I think for him, any type of reps he can get this year will be great. I think he will get reps. And look, if you're the Saints, if he starts looking good in smaller packages that you throw him in, I think you got to keep increasing that workload. It makes no sense not to. So absolutely reps for Trevor Penning. It's kind of all that matters right now for him.
He is Chris Rosvoglou at Rosvoglou Report on Twitter. Go give him a follow. You want to follow along with Trevor Penning and David Johnson there in New Orleans. He's from the Straight Up Saints podcast and Boot Krewe Media. Chris, always good talking with you, man.
Thank you for having me, Eliot.
And that'll do it for this week's episode of Corn Stalks and Sports Talk. Don't forget, before you go, make sure you subscribe or follow so you don't miss any episodes of Corn Stalks and Sports Talk. Of course, we have that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, the KOEL app, and more. You can always listen to our guest segments on YouTube. Those are always available, so if you miss any part of today's show, you can listen to those, or you can go find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, etc. My name is Eliot Clough, at Eliot Clough on Twitter. I'm a UNI insider for Town Square Media, and this was another week's episode of Corn Stalks and Sports Talk.
Prescription products require completion of an online medication consultation with an independent healthcare provider through the LifeMD platform and are only available if prescribed. Subscription required. Individual results may vary. Additional restrictions apply. Read all warnings before using GLP-1s. Side effects may include a risk of thyroid C-cell tumors. Do not use GLP-1s if you or your family have a history of thyroid cancer.
If you've struggled for years to lose weight and have given up hope, did you know you can now access GLP-1 prescription medications at TryLifeMD.com? We're now offering eligible patients online access to GLP-1s, the breakthrough prescription medication that can help you lose body fat and weight. Listen to what people are saying.
It's fun to put on jeans that you couldn't get into 6 months ago.
Every morning, I look forward to getting on the scale. For anybody who's struggling with their weight, it's a godsend.
And here's the best part. Your insurance may cover 100% of the cost of your medication. So go to TryLifeMD.com to have your eligibility checked right now. Get started today at TryLifeMD.com. That's TryLifeMD.com.